The most secretive place in the United States can be easily found on a map. A small piece of desert in the western part of the country known as Area 51. In recent years, this place has become a meme. Everyone has heard of it, many have read about it, but almost no one knows what actually happens there. You might never have heard of the existence of Area 51 if it were not for this man. This is Bob Lazar. In 1989, he gives an interview to a small television channel. Lazar claims that he is a former employee of the secret military base known as Area 51. According to the man, it is there that American authorities are hiding alien flying saucers, the aliens themselves, and conducting secret experiments. Lazar claims to have seen all this with his own eyes. This tale of grey aliens and saucers sounds like complete nonsense, but only until you begin to delve into the history of the so-called Area 51. And then it turns out that Lazar's story is true. At the very least, partially. This video brings you the complete history of the most secret place in America. Why, for nearly 50 years, officials in the United States did not even utter the phrase Area 51. When and for what purpose did this mysterious object appear? Why was some information about the area not disclosed even to American presidents? And finally, what is actually happening there? This is the real story of Area 51. Let's start with a quote from Churchill. "It is a riddle, wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma." That is how he once described Russia. But this phrase aptly describes the subject of today's video, as this secret has many layers. The first of which is the very existence of Area 51. Today this fact is beyond doubt, but 20 years ago everything was not so clear. For many, Area 51 was somewhere between Atlantis and El Dorado.
When you first become president, one of the questions that people ask you is, what's really going on at Area 51?
This is President of the United States Barack Obama's 2013 speech. The recording is primarily noteworthy because here the American president publicly utters the phrase Area 51 for the first time. And this is just a little over 10 years ago.
I think I just became the first president to ever publicly mention Area 51.
Only in the last 15 years, thanks to declassified documents, journalistic investigations, interviews with former employees and other sources, can we definitely say not only that Area 51 exists, but also answer the main question, what have American authorities been hiding there for more than half a century? Early in the morning, a reconnaissance plane takes off from a CIA secret base in Pakistan. At the controls is Gary Powers, an experienced American military pilot, and this is the most challenging mission of his life. The mission requires the pilot to reach the southern border of the USSR, then cross the entire territory of the Union to the north and land in Norway. Along the way, Powers needs to photograph secret objects, primarily two spaceports, Turatam and Plesetsk. Powers has at his disposal a massive camera that allows high-quality shooting from a distance of 13 miles. This number is not random, that is precisely the unattainable altitude at which the secret reconnaissance plane known as U-2 can fly. The aircraft in question is an achievement of American designers. The U-2 was not always detected by radars, and even highly advanced Soviet MiG aircraft, which flew significantly lower, could not intercept it. Over several years, Soviet missiles failed to shoot down any such aircraft over the Union's territory, even when it was detected by radars. For Powers, this was far from his first flight on a U-2. For the U-2, this was far from its first flight over the USSR. But for both, this mission was a true challenge. Never before had a reconnaissance aircraft crossed the Soviet Union from border to border. Powers was to be at the controls for 13 hours. Meanwhile, in Moscow, it was early morning. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was informed that the military had detected a high-flying aircraft that had crossed the Afghan border and was heading towards the USSR. Since it was not the first visit of a U-2 over the Union's territory, everyone understood whose aircraft it was and its purpose. The situation was further intensified by the fact that it was the 1st of May. Khrushchev believed that this was President Eisenhower mocking him. The Soviet leader gave the order to shoot down the aircraft at all costs. Approximately an hour and a half after Gary Powers took off, he was over the territory of Uzbekistan. Soon he was to reach his first target, the Tyuratam Cosmodrome, the same one from which Gagarin would launch a year later. It was then that the pilot noticed jet aircraft trails below. This meant that the U-2 was detected and Soviet MiGs had taken to the sky. However, Powers was not concerned and continued the mission. He was flying at an altitude unreachable for MiGs. When the U-2 was near Sverdlovsk, several projectiles exploded nearby. Moments later, the U-2 was shaken and it began to lose altitude rapidly. Powers understood that he had been shot down, both wings detached. The remaining part, along with the pilot, plummeted downward at high speed. With great difficulty, Powers managed to eject. However, the oxygen tube still connected him to the aircraft, so the falling U-2 continued to drag the pilot with it. Powers experienced extreme G-forces. Finally, he disconnected the tube and began a free fall. Moments later, the parachute opened. When the U-2 was shot down by a Soviet missile, it disappeared from the CIA's radar. This undoubtedly meant that the aircraft had crashed over the Union's territory. For the Intelligence Directorate, the situation was, of course, unpleasant, but not catastrophic. By their calculations, if a missile hit the U-2 followed by a crash, the aircraft would be completely destroyed and the pilot would be dead. If somehow the pilot managed to survive, he had a lethal pill to avoid capture. In short, CIA leaders were confident that the Soviets would not be able to obtain any valuable information from the wreckage or from the dead pilot in unidentifiable gear. This meant they would not learn about the crucial secrets of the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, the most significant of which was related to Area 51. The history of Area 51 is surprisingly linked to some of humanity's most global achievements: the creation of aircraft rockets, space exploration, and the discovery of nuclear energy. The history of Area 51 began with the bomb. The Manhattan Project, under which the United States developed nuclear weapons, became the first truly secret operation. In the 1940s, it involved 200,000 people in one way or another across dozens of locations throughout America. Outside of the Manhattan Project, no one knew about it. Harry Truman became president of the country in 1945. Only then was he told about the Manhattan Project. Before that, he simply did not have access to this information, despite holding high government positions, including being vice president. By Truman's order from the early 1950s, an existing military base in the desert in the western part of the country was chosen for nuclear testing. This enormous area, nearly 1,351 square miles, known as the Nevada Test Site, became the only such place within the United States. It was there, slightly later, that Area 51 appeared. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as numerous nuclear weapons tests, many among the American military began to believe that such bombs would lead not to the end of wars, but rather to an apocalypse. An alternative method, in their opinion, to prevent a nuclear catastrophe was espionage. If you know what your opponent intends, you can actively counter them. With the onset of the Cold War in the late 1940s, the United States' chief strategic adversary became the Soviet Union. Since recruiting spies in the USSR was nearly impossible, reconnaissance aircraft seemed a logical solution. However, the Americans had a problem. The existing reconnaissance aircraft left much to be desired, as clearly demonstrated by the Korean War in the early 1950s. Soviet MiG-15 were excellent at shooting down American reconnaissance aircraft. The United States needed new developments. The Lockheed U-2 spy plane was supposed to effectively solve the problem. Designers developed a model that, according to calculations, flew significantly higher than Soviet MiGs, and thus was unreachable. For the Air Force, this project was less interesting, as it could only conduct reconnaissance operations. Therefore, the CIA became the principal entity in developing the new reconnaissance aircraft. For this organization, espionage was the primary business. The secret U-2 project was headed by Richard Bissell, a high-ranking CIA official. President Eisenhower tasked him with choosing a location for testing the newest aircraft. The best option turned out to be a dried-up lake called Groom in the Nevada desert. A temporary runway already existed at this location. It was flanked by mountains to the north and south, which was advantageous in terms of secrecy. But most importantly, close by was the very Nevada test site where nuclear tests were conducted. Therefore, the location was already well fortified in terms of secrecy. The entire area of the Nevada test site was divided into small sections with ordinal numbers: Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 17, Zone 25, and so on. In each of them, different tests, trials, or developments were conducted, mainly related to nuclear weapons. The new site on the edge of the test range was assigned the number 51. Thus, in 1955, began the history of America's most secretive location. The desert of the state of Nevada is an uninhabited and inhospitable place. In the summer, it is so hot that under the sun you can fry eggs on metal surfaces. The strongest winds can sway the constructed hangars, and people are forced to wear special footwear as protection against rattlesnakes. Almost none of the employees at the new secret facility called it Zone 51. More commonly, they referred to it as Groom Lake, or the ranch. According to the recollections of the first pilots and mechanics of the U-2, Zone 51 was extremely secretive from the very start, and this secrecy was apparent in every aspect. Work was divided among several departments that did not intersect, and the workers of each department only knew the narrow information needed for their work. Only the leaders had the overall picture of what was occurring. All employees, from pilots to service personnel, underwent appropriate checks and signed non-disclosure agreements. The production shops of the Lockheed Company were located in the neighboring state of California. Parts for the U-2 were produced independently of one another, then delivered to the Groom Lake base, and only there assembled into the complete reconnaissance aircraft. Thus, the U-2 could only be seen by those who worked directly in Zone 51. Most pilots and mechanics lived with their families in neighboring California. Every day, special flights would pick them up from there and take them to work at Groom Lake, and in the evening, they would be flown back. The families of the employees were unaware of what their relatives were actually doing. One of the engineers later recalled that his wife and children were convinced that he was repairing televisions. A striking confirmation of the secrecy came in the form of an air disaster. In 1955, one of the planes transporting Zone 51 employees crashed in the mountains of Nevada. The relatives of the deceased only learned about the true profession of their loved ones at the beginning of the 21st century, when case materials were declassified. Even within the CIA, only a small circle of people was aware of the U-2's development. All these security measures surrounding the project contributed significantly to the history of unidentified flying objects and conspiracy theories about the government hiding the truth about them. In the late 1940s, the United States experienced an epidemic of flying saucers. Numerous reports from people who had seen UFOs from the ground, testimonies from pilots of civilian and military aircraft who claimed they had spotted something in the sky that surpassed the capabilities of modern technology in speed or altitude. This epidemic coincidentally aligned with a sharp leap in the development of aircraft. Ordinary citizens and even professional pilots were unaware of the secret developments of the military-industrial complex in the form of new jet aircraft or missiles, and therefore they logically mistook suspicious objects in the sky for alien ships. This does not mean that 100% of UFO cases were experiments with weaponry, but certainly a significant portion of them were. In the 1950s, a similar situation occurred many times with the U-2. The exterior of the reconnaissance aircraft was made of aluminum, and it was not initially painted in a dark color. Consequently, the silvery U-2 reflected sunlight excellently and stood out brightly against the dark sky. When civil or military aircraft pilots saw something shiny flying at an impossible altitude for that time, they naturally couldn't believe their eyes. Against the backdrop of the flying saucer epidemic, special departments were created in the Air Force and the CIA to investigate cases involving unidentified objects. However, given the secrecy of certain developments, including the U-2, the personnel investigating UFO incidents simply did not have access to the highly classified projects. Therefore, for them, many cases, such as those involving the U-2, were truly inexplicable. It's not surprising that some of those who worked in these departments later fueled the fire of conspiracy theories, claiming that the government was indeed hiding the real truth about UFOs and aliens. The CIA also contributed to the popularity of conspiracy theories about alien ships in the following way. In the early 1950s, the agency launched a media campaign to debunk incidents involving the CIA. Television programs and newspaper articles were supposed to explain to people that what they saw had quite rational explanations, ranging from natural phenomena to camera defects. However, these attempts were unsuccessful. Firstly, publications about mysterious aliens and unexplained phenomena garnered much larger audiences than the information debunking them. Secondly, years later, information surfaced that the CIA had funded media companies to debunk UFOs while secretly maintaining a department for investigating unidentified incidents. This further convinced ufologists of the government's concealment of real UFO facts. Moreover, in the latter half of the 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency realized that rumors and speculations about flying saucers actually worked to their advantage. Better for people to discuss UFOs than the truly top-secret weapons prototypes. This approach significantly influenced the reputation of Area 51 in the eyes of the public. On July 3, 1956, a landmark event occurred in the fate of the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft. Pilot Harvey Stockman made its first flight over Soviet territory. The U-2 took off from West Germany, reached Leningrad, conducted the planned photography, and returned safely to the base. This mission was necessary for the CIA to prove to President Eisenhower that the U-2 was worth the money and resources. The development and production of the aircraft proved very costly to American taxpayers. During his first flight over the Soviet Union, pilot Stockman took many valuable high-quality photographs, including images of Leningrad, which clearly showed the peaceful life of ordinary Soviet people going about their daily activities. For the Americans, this was a significant indication that the Soviet Union was not simply one gigantic militarized base where everyone was preparing for a major war against the United States. However, for U-2 project manager Richard Bissell and President Eisenhower, the bitter truth was that the reconnaissance plane was discovered by the Soviet military during its flight. In other words, the U-2 was not as undetectable by radar as initially expected. Although the MiGs dispatched for interception failed to engage, and the surface-to-air missiles proved ineffective, the Soviet leadership was aware of the American reconnaissance aircraft. Eisenhower feared that such an overt act of espionage could lead to nuclear war. However, Khrushchev chose not to publicly disclose this fact, as it would have demonstrated a weakness in Soviet defense. After some time, U-2 flights over Soviet territory resumed. For several years, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a game reminiscent of cat and mouse. Despite efforts to paint the U-2 aircraft with special dark coatings to make it less visible to radar, this had minimal effect. Ultimately, the Soviet military detected the aircraft and attempted to intercept it using MiGs or shoot it down with missiles, but without success. Everything changed on May 1, 1960, following the flight of Gary Powers. The downing of the U-2 over Soviet territory to some extent signaled the beginning of the end of the legendary reconnaissance aircraft. For the United States, the incident involving Gary Powers' secret mission turned into a major embarrassment. The CIA assured President Eisenhower that the pilot could not have survived. The pilot had no identifying marks, and thus, officially, the United States adhered to a pre-prepared cover story. The downed plane was a civilian aircraft conducting weather research for NASA. Meanwhile, Khrushchev demanded acknowledgement of the espionage and an apology. He knew that the Americans were unaware that Soviet intelligence was, at that very time, interrogating a very much alive pilot, Powers. The United States continued to maintain that it was a civilian scientific mission, thus nothing merited an apology. This political poker game endured for nearly a week. Ultimately, Khrushchev publicly declared that they had captured the spy pilot Powers. Eisenhower found himself in a challenging situation. Not only had the fact of United States espionage become evident, but he, the president of the country, was also publicly lying by calling the plane civilian. According to Power's recollections, the Soviet side wanted to find out where his U-2 training flights took place. The pilot knew full well that this was at Area 51 in Nevada. However, during interrogations, he mentioned a different location, Watertown Base, in a neighboring state. NASA adhered to this cover story as well. In a press release, the space agency claimed that U-2 training flights took place at Watertown Base. The aim of the disinformation was, of course, to divert attention from Area 51. This narrative primarily targeted the internal American public. The existence of Area 51 had been known in the Soviet Union for quite some time. The thing is, the Soviet Union significantly lagged behind the United States in the development of reconnaissance aircraft, but it excelled in missile engineering, nuclear weaponry production, and astronautics. Satellite images of Area 51 had been at the disposal of the Soviet authorities for several years. The quality and detail of the images left much to be desired, but nevertheless, the USSR was aware of the secret facility. In that very year of 1961, several events occurred that directly influenced the fate of the U-2 project and Area 51. First was the fall of Powers. In his memoirs, he confessed that he did not reveal any important information about the aircraft or Area 51 during interrogations in the Soviet Union. But how true this is, we do not know. Furthermore, it became evident that the U-2 was not so invulnerable. Missiles could shoot them down. Then there was the famous Bay of Pigs invasion, the covert operation by the United States in which they attempted to overthrow the Castro government in Cuba. The attempt was a resounding failure, and the operation's leader was forced to resign. This was the very same CIA officer Richard Bissell who also headed the U-2 project. At the end of 1961, the USSR tested and exploded the so-called Tsar Bomba on Novaya Zemlya. This thermonuclear bomb is still considered the most powerful explosive device in human history. Hence, the nuclear arms race reached a new level, meaning it was crucial for the Americans to know what was happening at Soviet military sites. In short, the United States needed a new reconnaissance aircraft that significantly outperformed the U-2. It had to be much faster, higher, and less detectable. Thus, by the early 1960s, the history of the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft at Area 51 came to an end. The aircraft itself still operates primarily in NASA civilian projects, but it has long ceased to be either advanced or secret. Over the past 30 years, many CIA documents about this project have been declassified and have largely confirmed the information that journalists learned from those involved in the U-2's development or from materials leaked to the public domain. The story of Area 51 could have ended in the late 1950s. At that time, several tests of so-called dirty bombs were conducted in the immediate proximity in Zone Number 13. These are powerful explosive devices containing radioactive substances. After such tests, the area is contaminated for many years ahead or requires special cleaning. Zone 13 is only 9 miles from Groom Lake. Thus, for a couple of years following the powerful test explosions in the late 1950s, Area 51 turned into a ghost base. No activity occurred there. The rebirth and future prosperity of the object owe much to bats. Since the time of Leonardo da Vinci, humanity has tried to harness the principles of the animal world to invent flying machines. When the engineers at Lockheed faced the challenging task of creating a reconnaissance aircraft far superior to the U-2, they turned to bats. The fact is that a stealth aircraft does not mean the object becomes physically invisible. It means that it is invisible to radar. Radars are somewhat reminiscent of bats. These creatures can see in the dark thanks to echolocation. They produce a kind of squeak. Sound waves reach an object, such as potential prey, and echo back to the bat. This is how it understands what the object is and how far away it is. Simply put, with the help of sound, a kind of 3D model of the surrounding space is constructed in the bat's head. Accordingly, an airplane can be made invisible in the following way. It must either absorb radar signals or redirect them in another direction. Additionally, the invisibility and invulnerability of the reconnaissance aircraft would be significantly enhanced if it were superfast and able to fly at very high altitudes. The task of combining speed, altitude, and invisibility in a single model seemed impossible. However, the engineers at Lockheed managed to solve it. In the middle of 1962, testing began on the new secret Lockheed A-12 reconnaissance aircraft, also known as the secret project Oxcart, at Area 51. This marvel of technology, with a body made of titanium, could ascend to 16 miles, higher than the U-2 and several times higher than passenger planes of that time. Moreover, the A-12 was capable of flying 3 times the speed of sound, meaning it could theoretically cross the distance from New York to Paris across the Atlantic in just an hour and a half. And throughout all this, the plane was practically invisible to radars. Even today, such descriptions are impressive, and for the early 1960s, this aircraft was cooler than all alien flying saucers combined. From the very beginning of its existence, Area 51 was a classified facility, but from the start of the A-12 flight tests, security reached a new level. In 2007, some CIA documents regarding the development and testing of the Oxcart A-12 project were declassified. They indicate that in the early 1960s, the CIA actively monitored any mentions of Area 51 or the new aircraft, including monitoring calls, contacts, and correspondences of journalists that dealt with the secret development. Even ordinary civilians could raise suspicions if they mentioned anything related to the area or the aircraft. Increased security measures were, of course, applied to those who worked at the Groom Lake base. In addition to the already strict standard procedures for verification and control, there were also unusual requirements. For instance, all test pilots of the new aircraft were required to be married, with specific requirements for the wives as well, such as mental health and an absence of alcohol or other dependencies. Of course, the wife had no idea about what her pilot husband was actually doing. Kenneth Collins was among those who, in the early 1960s, participated in the test flights of the newest A-12 at Area 51. By that time, the base had expanded, with additional hangars built for accommodation. The pilot and other personnel were flown to Groom Lake from nearby California on Mondays and returned to their families on Fridays. During one of Collins's test flights on the A-12, there was a control issue. Miraculously, he managed to eject and survive. As a result, the pilot faced a rigorous interrogation involving hypnosis and a truth serum. The CIA was trying to determine that the pilot was telling the truth and that he was not at fault for the aircraft crash. Ultimately, only weeks after the incident did the investigation determine that the cause was the incorrect functioning of one of the sensors. During those weeks, the CIA collected all the debris of the A-12, firstly to prevent them from falling into the hands of potential spies, and secondly because titanium, from which the aircraft was made, is an extremely expensive material. Right after the beginning of the A-12 tests at Area 51, reports of UFOs in the region increased significantly. Passenger aircraft pilots were particularly concerned about what they saw. They observed something in the sky that flew several times higher and 5 times faster than their contemporary airliners. Given the still popular theme of UFOs, the answer was obvious to many. In 1962, NASA conducted a routine test of the 10 rocket plane. Photography was one of the stages of the test flights. In one of the photos of the 10 pilot, something very similar to a UFO appeared in the corner of the frame. The 10 was not classified, so NASA frequently published photographs from the tests. As a result, many concluded that the photograph was nothing less than another confirmation of UFO presence. What NASA employees did not know was that on the same day, tests of the A-12 aircraft were being conducted at a secret base in a neighboring state. It was, in fact, the A-12 captured in their frame. In 2007, among declassified documents was a record of a CIA employee reporting on this situation. In 1966, the country's leading news anchor, Walter Cronkite, aired a significant television report dedicated to mysterious objects in the sky. Casual witnesses and representatives of departments investigating unidentified flying objects recounted incidents that defied explanation. At the same time, the invited high-ranking Air Force representative, of course, could say nothing about the U-2 aircraft, the A-12 or Area 51, for at that time, knowledge about these projects was possessed only by select members of the CIA and the Air Force. And the materials on the developments were only declassified half a century later. The A-12 aircraft, like its predecessor, the U-2, were primarily CIA projects. The United States Air Force was also involved in the operations of Area 51. Their personnel were mainly engaged in technical tasks related to the A-12 aircraft, transporting project participants to and from the base, providing fuel, equipment, and other necessary supplies. However, gradually the Air Force and the CIA became competitors in the struggle for supremacy over Area 51. The Air Force was developing its own reconnaissance aircraft with stealth technology. This refers to the famous SR-71, also known as the Blackbird due to its appearance. The aircraft utilized many advancements from the A-12, and considering that the development of each model cost billions of dollars, it was clear that only one would ultimately remain. To prevent the closure of the A-12 project, the CIA director needed to find a use for the aircraft. The ongoing Vietnam War turned out to be extremely timely. The confrontation between North and South Vietnam is one of the main chapters of the Cold War. One side was supported and armed by the USSR, the other by the United States. Thanks to the success of the Union in missile development, North Vietnamese forces effectively shot down American aircraft. To uncover the locations of missile sites, the United States needed a good reconnaissance aircraft. The A-12 was precisely such an aircraft. When discussing Area 51, it's usually in the context of the United States, but few know about the existence of this secret facility in Japan. To conduct A-12 reconnaissance operations over Vietnam, the CIA needed a secret location for takeoff, landing and maintenance in relatively close proximity. Thus, in 1967, a branch of Area 51 appeared on the island of Okinawa in Japan, a military base called Kadena. The same level of secrecy applied to this location as to the original on Groom Lake. One of the pilots assigned to the new base was Harvey Stockman, an aviator who had made a first flight on the U-2 over the USSR 10 years earlier. The new A-12 aircraft significantly outperformed its predecessor. In addition to speed and altitude, it was nearly invisible to radar in more than 90% of cases. With the A-12, Americans effectively located Soviet missile sites in Vietnamese possession, and soon the number of American aircraft being shot down sharply decreased. During this period, the A-12 even managed to some extent to prevent a new war. This refers to the so-called Pueblo incident. In January 1968, an American ship named the Pueblo was several dozen miles off the coast of North Korea. The ship was conducting scientific research, and its crew consisted of 80 people, some of whom were scientists, while others were sailors. This was the cover story. In reality, the Pueblo was a reconnaissance ship, equipped with secret equipment and documentation, and part of the crew was CIA operative. The ship was spotted by a North Korean military vessel. Although the Pueblo was not violating the border at that moment and was in international waters, the Koreans initiated an attack. One crew member was killed and the rest were taken captive. United States President Lyndon Johnson, upon learning of the situation, was furious. The Department of Defense immediately prepared a plan for a massive strike on North Korean territory. In fact, it was essentially the start of a new war, which the United States, considering its ongoing campaign in Vietnam, could ill afford. CIA Director Helms proposed an alternative plan. His plan involved a reconnaissance operation by an A-12 aircraft. The pilots could covertly scan the entire territory of North Korea from high altitude in search of the Pueblo ship and its crew. If they were alive, a diplomatic process could be initiated instead of going to war. Ultimately, this is exactly what happened. During the A-12 flight, It was able to capture images not only of the ship itself, but also of the crew members in captivity, and confirmed that North Korea was not making preparations for war. All of this was done by the A-12 aircraft without being detected by enemy radar. 11 months later, the American captives were released. By the end of the 1960s, the USAF SR-71 Blackbird project was adopted for service. Despite the successful results shown by the A-12, this not only meant the closure of the Area 51 branch in Japan, but also the termination of the entire reconnaissance aircraft project. On the last day before returning home to America, the pilots took final photographs beside their planes. However, these photos did not find an honorable place on their office walls. Instead, they lay for 50 years in the CIA archives, only to be declassified alongside other documents of the program. Some of the A-12 pilots, after the project's closure, went on to serve on the new SR-71 aircraft, which in many ways resembled its predecessor. Their comrades were incredibly surprised by the expertise in handling the revolutionary aircraft, which previously had no equivalents. However, due to the A-12 project's secrecy, its former pilots could not even tell their new colleagues that they had spent the previous 6 years at the helm of a similar aircraft. One of the main conspiracy theories regarding Area 51 is related to alien spacecraft. Allegedly, the authorities managed to capture a flying saucer, and not just one, conducting experiments with them in that very secret location at Groom Lake. Primarily, they engage in what is known as reverse engineering. This involves dismantling a complex object to understand how it functions, and then using the acquired knowledge for their own developments. Looking ahead, this, according to Bob Lazar, was one of his duties when he worked at Area 51. And this information is partly true. Here is what I mean. August 1966. Colonel Munir Redfar of the Iraqi Air Force boards a MiG-21 aircraft at a military base in the south of the country and heads for Baghdad. It is a routine scheduled flight. However, en route, Redfar makes a sudden turn. The ground command orders him to fly back. However, instead of that, Redfar descends to an altitude of only a few hundred meters to avoid radar detection and continues on his way. He flies over the territory of Turkey, over the Mediterranean Sea, and heads towards the territory of his enemy in Israeli Tel Aviv, where $1 million await him. Several years prior, the Israeli Secret Service Mossad began planning a special operation. Its goal was to procure a Soviet MiG-21 aircraft. The USSR was skilled at producing exceptional military aircraft, with the MiGs being paramount. These fighter jets had proven their superiority in many military conflicts. This posed a problem for Israel, as the USSR was supplying MiGs to their direct opponents, Iraq, Syria, and Egypt. Understanding the design of this advanced aircraft could significantly boost Israel's defense capabilities. After years of searching, Mossad contacted a pilot of the Iraqi Air Force, Munir Redfar, who agreed to steal a MiG-21. The operation was named Diamond. The story made headlines in the world's leading newspapers and became the basis for a Hollywood film. However, what journalists didn't know was that after Israel had studied the MiG's design, they secretly transferred the aircraft to the United States, to a small military base in Nevada called Area 51. T.D. Barnes was working on the 15 rocket plane projects for NASA. After the program ended in the late 60s, he was offered a position on a secret project in the Nevada desert. This is how he learned about the existence of Area 51. Barnes recounted that on his first day of work he was brought to the base area on a plane with covered windows. Upon landing, the pilot made a strange remark. Something like, "They took out the donut." The phrase made no sense until T.D. Barnes found out that donut in Area 51 referred to the Soviet MiG-21 due to its recognizable round nose with an inlet. Barnes's direct work was the reverse engineering of the Soviet aircraft. The MiGs posed great challenges not only to Israel but also to the United States. The combat capabilities of these aircraft were well demonstrated in the Vietnam War. Therefore, the reverse engineering efforts, test flights on the MiGs, and trials of stolen Soviet radar systems in Area 51 were crucial for the United States amid the Cold War. The documents related to these tests were declassified only in the late 2000s. Thus, Bob Lazar was right. The reverse engineering of advanced enemy aircraft was one of the direct purposes of Area 51. It's just that it was the engineering of quite earthly aircraft and technologies, not alien ships, which of course is not as intriguing, but closer to the truth. Have you ever heard of Area 52? I'm sure most people have no idea about this place. Strangely enough, a secret military base in the Nevada desert called Area 52 was created in the image and likeness of Area 51, yet larger and more expansive. However, it ultimately turned out that there was little attention given to any theories about alien ship testing, no talks of little green or grey men, and no movies, books or endless videos on the internet. Area 52 is known as the Tonopah Test Range and is located approximately 44 miles from Area 51. What primarily connects these two places is another ambitious project, the F-117 stealth aircraft, or Black Hawk. In the mid-1970s, the US Air Force decided to combine all the advanced developments of previous aircraft projects from Area 51, meaning to take high speed, altitude, and radar stealth, and add to that the capability to carry weapons and conduct ground attack missions. Thus, the F-117 attack aircraft was developed. Its initial test flights were conducted over Groom Lake. However, it quickly became clear that the base's area was too small for testing the new aircraft. The Air Force leadership then remembered the Tonopah Test Range. It was originally built back in the late 1950s for bomb testing, but eventually the necessity for the range quickly faded away, leaving it semi-abandoned for a long period. The site was revived and rebuilt specifically for testing the new F-117 aircraft. The Black Hawk successfully underwent numerous tests at Area 52 and participated in many military conflicts worldwide involving Americans over the next 20 years. Here, an important moment in our narrative requires clarification. In the late 2000s of the current century, many documents regarding Area 51 and the projects conducted there were declassified. Thus, the American government officially acknowledged the existence of the famous secret base in the state of Nevada. This later enabled high-ranking officials of the country, including the president, to publicly pronounce the term Area 51. The problem is that the declassified documents mostly pertained to the 1950s, 1960s, and partially the 1970s. Almost everything that occurred in Area 51 starting from the 1980s remains top secret. The fact is that even before the documents about the U-2 or A-12 project began to be declassified in the late 2000s, it was already possible to piece together an accurate history of these developments. Journalists spoke with dozens of former Area 51 workers. Various documents leaked into the public domain. CIA or Air Force officials might have inadvertently said something in interviews, and incidents occurred related to testing various developments. Later, declassified documents merely confirmed much of what was already known about what happened in Area 51 during the 1950s and 1960s. Thus, we can, with a high degree of probability, reconstruct what has been concealed at Groom Lake over the past 4 decades. And the key word in this investigation is drones. One of the first to see the military potential of drones was Nikola Tesla. He even attempted to sell the concept to military departments of several countries, but was unsuccessful. The Americans themselves used a kind of drones during the Second World War. These were radio-controlled bombs launched at aircraft. The technology did not prove very effective, yet some military personnel already saw the future in this. General Henry Arnold during the Second World War stated that the next great war would be fought with drones. He was off by a few major wars and several decades, but in essence he was right. The CIA began work on a drone reconnaissance project in Area 51 in the early 1960s. It was a modification of the already familiar A-12 aircraft. The model was named M21, and it carried an unmanned aerial vehicle called the D-21. The concept was to have the plane deliver the drone to the required point and launch it. The drone would then complete its task of taking photographs and fly toward the ocean. where it would land on the water and be retrieved by American military forces. The project's trials were conducted in Area 51, but the development history was short-lived. Its very first mission over Chinese territory failed. The D-21 mistakenly flew into Soviet territory and crashed there. Then, for several decades, drones moved to the background. The CIA continued to develop several projects that mimicked birds, but drones were still very expensive to develop and produce, and their effectiveness was unclear, so priority was entirely given to manned aircraft. The situation changed in the 1990s. At that time, the CIA and the Air Force realized the reconnaissance and combat potential of drones. These are projects like the MQ-1, also known as the Predator, and the MQ-9, known as the Reaper. Both drones were tested, among other locations, in Area 51. These aircraft have played a huge role in many military conflicts over the last 20 years, including the fight against terrorism. Many leaders of terrorist organizations, including bin Laden, were eliminated with the help of these drones. As for the last 15 years of Area 51's history, all discussions about what is happening there now are pure speculation. No one knows what armaments or technologies are being developed there today. We will most likely find out about it in about 50 years. And this does not only concern us, ordinary mortals, but even officials such as the President of the United States. I have already mentioned that many Area 51 projects were so secret that while the country's president knew about them, for instance, the vice president was not informed. But this is not the limit of secrecy. A highly illustrative situation occurred in 1994. At that time, President Bill Clinton ordered an investigation into some controversial nuclear tests on the very Nevada test site territory. Thus, some points concerning Area 51 were removed from the Commission's findings because even the President did not have the necessary level of access to this data. Area 51 remains a super-secret place. This is a small part of the so-called Nellis Air Force Base, a vast area in the Nevada desert where various types of weapons are also developed and tested, most of which are naturally classified. Almost the entire area of the base is a no-fly zone, and entry to the secured areas is well guarded. As a result, we encounter a wide array of conspiracy theories, most specifically associated with Area 51. This is the opportune moment to return to that very interview with Bob Lazar in 1989, which was where we began. After all, it was this event that directly influenced the popularity of this area. In brief, Bob Lazar stated the following. In the early 1980s, he worked at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. The institution was established 40 years prior for the famous Manhattan Project. There, he allegedly met with scientist Edward Teller. 8 years later, when Lazar was experiencing job troubles, it was Teller who found him a position in a secret project. Thus, Bob Lazar found himself in Area 51. More precisely, according to him, it was a laboratory called S4, which was part of Area 51. It was in this laboratory that there were 9 alien flying saucers, which Bob Lazar was to work on through reverse engineering. He was also shown drawings of certain beings resembling aliens who supposedly piloted these ships. Later, Lazar briefly saw what he was not supposed to, namely real, live little grey men with large heads. They were sitting in a chamber under guard. Because the man saw more than he should have, he was allegedly fired from Area 51. Understanding the importance of what he witnessed, he decided to make it public and gave an interview to a television channel in Las Vegas. Later, unpleasant details of Lazar's biography emerged. He had a conviction for pimping, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology stated that Lazar never studied there, although the man claimed he graduated from this prestigious institution. He sold the rights to his story to a big Hollywood studio, then disappeared for a long time and later reappeared in the media with the same story. In a word, an extremely controversial character. Lazar epitomizes one of the main conspiracy theories surrounding Area 51. There, authorities are said to be dissecting aliens and flying saucers. Well, let's calmly analyze if what Lazar said is true. The arguments in his favor are that the man has been extremely consistent in his statements for more than 30 years. That is, in all his interviews, he confidently tells his story without contradicting himself or mixing up facts. Lazar's supporters, and Lazar himself, assert that the unsavory details of his biography were fabricated by the CIA as part of a disinformation campaign to portray him as some madman spouting nonsense while never working at Area 51 or even having an education. Are the special services capable of such a thing? Theoretically, of course, and that is perhaps all the arguments in support of Lazar. What is on the other side of the scale? Bob Lazar is the sole source of his story. There are no other individuals who corroborate his claims of grey aliens, 9 flying saucers, and a mysterious laboratory at Area 51. There isn't even anyone who can confirm that Lazar ever worked at Area 51. Annie Jacobson, the author of one of the most detailed books on the history of the Groom Lake military base, conducted interviews with 70 individuals involved in projects at Area 51, half of whom worked directly on its premises. Not a single one of them ever encountered Bob Lazar. Moreover, even within UFO circles, many consider Lazar to be an imposter. One such person is the renowned scientist Stanton Friedman, author of a book on the famous Roswell incident, in which he argues that it is nothing other than an extraterrestrial object. To dot the I's and cross the T's, it is necessary to focus on the following. If we specifically address the topic of Area 51, as of today, there is not a single reasonably reliable piece of evidence corroborated by multiple independent sources that suggests extraterrestrial crafts or aliens were or are present on the military base. Period. Besides the alien theories, there are 2 other popular conspiracy theories regarding Area 51. One is that the American moon landing was filmed there, and the other is that there are tunnels running through the country supposedly meant for high-ranking officials of the United States in the event of a nuclear war. Both theories are complete nonsense, yet they are both based on quite real facts. First, participants of the moon landing underwent training near Area 51 on the very testing grounds. Craters formed by nuclear explosions there resembled the lunar surface, providing astronauts with a close approximation of what they might encounter during the mission. Finally, the second, tunnels do exist, but they're not located on Area 51, rather beneath other sections of the Nevada test site. As I have previously mentioned, this range primarily existed for nuclear testing, most of which took place deep underground in special tunnels. There are indeed a vast number of these tunnels in that area, but none lead to Washington. An ideal conclusion to this narrative is a small story. In August 1783 in France, the Montgolfier brothers conducted one of the first tests of their hot air balloon. At that time, lightning struck the flying apparatus, causing it to catch fire and plummet to a small village. The local residents, upon seeing the large burning object descending from the sky, took it for a celestial monster. Some ran away while others gathered at the crash site and began to destroy it with pitchforks and scythes. This situation is a vivid example of what happens to humans when their knowledge does not keep pace with the development of technology. In essence, that is precisely the whole story of the myth surrounding Area 51.